We have a beautiful day. It's only cold, remember, not snow, not ice, just a little chilly. And glad you made it. My name's Dan Wagner. I'm in the School of Education. And you are at the ICT4D Provost Seminar um, that today has the honor and privilege of hosting Michael Trucano in from the World Bank. And I've had occasion to make introductions here before, and usually I have the person's CV and the blurb that was sent out to you. But in this particular case, I've known this guy since he was much younger, and I know some of the intimate details, which I will mainly not share with you. But I've known Mike Trucano now in several different iterations of his career, and it's a real pleasure to have him back here. He was here. We were trying to think. I think we're getting too old even to remember when he was here last, but I think it was around 8 to 10 years ago when we were just thinking at Penn of starting a course on ICT4D, which was, I think it was around the time that you were here last. At that time, Mike was still in a group that has been part of the World Bank for about a dozen years called InfoDev. So if you Googled Mike, as some of you might want to do at one point or another, even during the talk, you'll see that he had a number of years at InfoDev, which is still alive and well. But Mike has, since that time, moved over into the Human Development Network in Education at the World Bank as their principal ICT or Technology Education Advisor. He was saying to me earlier, reminding me that he was at Bowdoin College and then at the Germantown Foreign Service Institute, is it? What did I say? Germantown. That's Philadelphia. Georgetown, so sorry. And what was it? The School of Foreign Service. Sorry. Okay, so there you have it. And he managed to avoid a career in the Foreign Service by doing all kinds of interesting things in the area of information technology, education, and related areas. He has, I think, for the last nearly 10 years been what I would call the go-to person if you are interested in what the World Bank and related agencies are doing in the area of ICT. He was sharing with us, a few of us earlier, how he gets he doesn't get to spend the billions of dollars that the bank spends in technology, but his fingerprints are sometimes on the programs that get funded. So I encourage you either during his presentation, if you have a question, he's offered to take questions at any time, or afterwards to ask what had happened to those fingerprints. And if you have ideas for good projects for the World Bank, you might want to raise your hand and suggest them. So Mike is one of the people that we really count on in the field to be an honest broker between academia, the corporate sector, the UN agencies, really one of the key people, I would say globally, who works on ICT and education. So we're very glad to have you here with us today, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Professor Wagner. Dan, can you hear me with this microphone? Okay, so I talk all day long every day, but I never talk for this number of minutes consecutively, just listening to my own voice. So I'm happy to be interrupted, challenged, all that kind of stuff. I'm used to it, so feel free. I'm going to talk today, general title, I guess, for this, Emerging Trends in Technology Use in Education in Developing Countries, including some that you may not have heard about. So again, please feel free to ask questions at any point during my talk. Thanks for taking time out of your busy days on this nice, bright, sunny day here in Philadelphia. Thank you very much, Dan, for inviting me, and by proxy, I guess, the World Bank, to share with you some of the stuff that we're seeing and hearing around the world, and for the chance to talk with you for the next however long we end up talking with each other. With that said, let's kick it off. Okay, this, I don't know if anybody knows what this is, what this picture is. It's not, some wags may say, it's not the, sort of a historical artifact of World Bank developmental assistance being deposited down in Africa or someplace, the latest and greatest shiny thing dropped off with a bunch of foreign advisors and then who then leave. That's the IBM 350. It's the first commercially available hard drive. September 2nd, 1956, I think it was introduced. 5 megabytes, over a ton. Just give a sense. So we've come a long way in the space of half a century, and thinking about technology's relevance certainly in all of our lives and in the lives of the places where the World Bank is active, perhaps a little bit more recently. But in thinking about these innovations, or what are innovations? It's something we get asked about a lot, and countries come to us and say, can you help us be innovative and to innovate stuff? And we'd say, okay, but what does that mean? Innovations, a lot of people, this idea of innovation is just a light bulb that goes off sort of in their head. So it's an idea. You know, it's a positive change of some sort, I guess, more generally speaking, a positive new change. There can be such thing as a new change. And a lot of people say ICTs, you introduce ICTs into something, you're automatically doing something that's innovative. You're automatically introducing some sort of innovation. At least that's what some people say. I don't know if you've heard this quote or seen this quote before in the news recently. I believe that the mobile phone is destined to revolutionize our education system, and in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. It's possible to touch every branch of human knowledge through the mobile phone. If you did hear that, it was someone paraphrasing an earlier quote about 10 years ago about the power and the potential of the internet to revolutionize our education system. And if you saw that quote, it was a paraphrasing of an earlier quote 20 years earlier about the potential of the computer to revolutionize the way we educate ourselves and others. And if so, they were paraphrasing something that Thomas Edison said back in 1922 about the potential and the promise of the motion picture. So I mentioned this as a start, as a way to think, you know, a lot of this seems really new, but there's a lot here that actually isn't new. Or a lot of what we learned perhaps are things that we've relearned or we've forgotten. And I maybe touch on some of those things as well. So what's new may not be as new perhaps as we might think it is. I'm going to talk about a couple themes, I think about 5 general themes. I'm going to talk about content, going to talk about community, going to talk about things that are personal, going to talk about things that are mobile, and going to talk about measuring all this stuff. And I guess I should have said, as Dan said, my name is Mike Trucano. I usually speak to people for whom English is not their primary working language. I know I don't have that issue here at Penn, so I can get going a little bit fast. I'm assuming that's not an issue, but if it is, just flag me and I'll slow down. And presumably my Minnesota accent is not a problem for anyone in the room either. Also, as the ICT guy at the World Bank, they say you need PowerPoint. I actually don't like to use PowerPoint. If I can not use it, I'm happy. So if I'm going to use it, I'm going to go all in, as they say in Las Vegas. So I have over 200 slides. We'll see how quickly I can get through them. And lastly, I'm Mike Trucano. As Dan said, I'm the Senior ICT and Education Specialist at the World Bank. The World Bank's the largest multilateral provider of developmental assistance around the world. My job at the bank, if you will, is to help people get smart, or there are a lot of smart people out there, get smarter, if you will, about appropriate, relevant, effective, and I think just as importantly, inappropriate, irrelevant, and ineffective uses of technologies to aid a wide variety of developmental objectives, especially and including what I'm going to talk and we're going to talk together about this afternoon, education. Asking ourselves, what do we know about using technology in education in developing countries, and especially what do we know about using it effectively? So the book has been a standard technology used in education for hundreds of years. There's a picture of a book. We all know what that looks like. As this transforms into the e-book or e-readers, what might change? Here's a picture of the Wikipedia in the palm of your hand. One AAA battery lasts about a year. Changes our conception of perhaps what's possible and what technology can make possible and relevant to people in places where access to huge amounts of printed materials perhaps hasn't been a luxury for quite some time that people can afford. Interactive radio instruction, there's at least one person here who knows quite a lot about this. We've been involved at the World Bank in using radio in inventive ways for about 30 years to help reach communities around the world. Here's some places where interactive radio has been used, I guess, productively and profitably in all sorts of different environments. Computers have been used. We've been involved in the use of computers in education probably for about 20 years. This picture is some variant of that you will see in World Bank project documents probably for, about the last 2 decades. Television we've been involved with for about 40 years. Thinking about oftentimes internalizing and learning from the experiences here in the States with Sesame Street. There's when that's the HIV positive Muppet from South Africa who visited the World Bank a couple of years ago. And now the mobile phone, which is sort of the ICT device du jour of choice, is something that people are challenging us to think about its relevance to a lot of the things we do and a lot of the challenges that people face around the world. Laptops in various shapes and colors and sizes and with acronyms are something that people ask us to think about. And increasingly tablets. Now, literally every project proposal, large scale, that comes across my desk has in there as one of the first questions, what kind of tablet should we buy? I don't know if that's necessarily a good or certainly not one of the first questions that people should be asking, but ministries of education now, this is something they're asking as almost a first order of business. But are we going to talk about all this cool technology stuff? I'm happy to, but no, that's not my point here this afternoon. I can ask a couple questions, I guess, of myself and of all of us here in the room, thinking about how might we think about innovating in education with the aid of new technologies, knowing that newer, cooler, more powerful, sleeker stuff, more versatile stuff is always just right around the corner. We know that the pace of innovation in the technology sector has traditionally and presumably always will outpace our ability to innovate on the policy side. If that's so, how do we plan? How do we think about, how do we conceptualize our use of technology and plan for this use going forward when what we plan for may be obsolete by the time we actually get our related policy in place? You know, we're asked a lot of narrow questions like what kind of tablet should would we recommend an education system use? We're asked, you know, do you think we should buy open or closed information systems? Should we be using PCs or phones to support our teachers? Should we be talking about doing everything mobile, or is the school still a real locus for the use of technology? What do you guys think? And we're asked these types of questions, and we say yes to all those. I mean, yeah, all this stuff you should be thinking about depending on what's relevant, what's useful, what's appropriate to your context. We think these are some of the, while we understand these questions and they're valid within certain contexts, we think these are really some of the wrong questions that you should be asking to start. What are some other questions? Well, how can we innovate with something that we already have? People are interested in the newest, latest, greatest thing, whether it's the latest smartphone now or a really low-cost laptop 5 years ago. And there's oftentimes, maybe it's a commercial disincentive or maybe it's a mental block, but to think about how we can innovate using technologies that are already around us, perhaps used in other contexts and other ways. Are there useful things we can do? Are there useful practices from around the world that we can learn from that might be able to be implemented at a lower cost in more relevant ways? So I thought we'd take a quick tour around the world of a number of things that are going on, some of which you may be well familiar with, some of which may be brand new. The things you are familiar with, hopefully, maybe we'll put a little bit of a different spin on them. I don't know if you guys recognize this. Somebody in the room has to recognize, other than Dan, has to recognize this picture. This is the, actually it's the second installation of the hole in the wall in a slum area in Delhi. That's Sugata Mitra, professor who famously stuck a computer in a wall and left and watched what happened with kids. And surprise, surprise, kids used the computer. They learned how to do stuff. And lots of people, you know, an easy to draw lesson, it's a lesson commonly drawn from this, is that you just give kids computers and they'll learn how to use them. And then I guess by extension it follows that if they learn how to use them, they'll learn how to learn with them. And that's, I think, a little, a more dubious, perhaps, conclusion to draw simply from this. But one of the interesting things I think about this experiment where indeed they put, these are, again, low-income communities in Delhi, where they found that kids would use the computers. And why would they use them? They'd use them not because people just built them, but because they invested a lot in certain things. People saw that a computer was sitting in the wall and they thought, that's what we need to do. And the folks at the involved with this project and the NGO that was born and later the company born around it said, actually, they have made lots of investments in content, relevant educational content, and in developing people, the skills of people in the community to support the use of the technology, to support children when they had problems, to introduce to other people in the community what was happening with these installations so that they would, if not support, at least permit these types of uses. There was actually a really well thought out, and there's a lot of investment going in, not on the technology side, but on some other things that actually, what I think is perhaps some of the most interesting findings from that sort of experience. So on this content stuff, we're seeing around the world this idea of user-generated content. Certainly here at Penn, you guys all are familiar with the potential of all of you to add, whether it's via Wikipedia or sharing your assignments online or whatever you're doing, having your professors generate content themselves for your classes. The Open Education Resources Movement, this larger initiative to make available educational content using open licenses in ways so that they can be remixed, reused, is something that we see really impacting now the educational publishing industries in lots of countries in Africa and Asia. Whereas this was a sideline interest or sideline activity not too long ago, the fact that there is this free content available is one of many, but an important pressure point on a lot of the educational publishers that we see, and they're having to figure out what is our model for actually, what are our incentives to create educational content if there's this stuff freely available out there. And I'll get back to that because I think they're changing. We're seeing interesting changes in models. What educational publishers are in many places today are changing in interesting ways we think will impact the way education is delivered in certain places. But this open educational resources trend, I think, is one to monitor. Of course, you're familiar with things like Flickr and Wikipedia. I don't know if you know the Shuttleworth Foundation in South Africa. These are the Mark Shuttleworth, I guess the patron of the Ubuntu operating system. You know, he bought a bunch of textbooks from publishers, put them into the public Creative Commons license, said, we want to make these freely available because we think we should be investing things in other areas and not investing the same monies in developing the same sorts of things. We see in the Nordic countries especially a real interest in making available educational content under open licenses, and in some cases this is then translated to the places where these countries are active in providing developmental assistance as well. The World Bank has been active in supporting projects in this area as well, and in other approaches to using open content. This is a game that we helped develop. It's called Evoke, sort of a social media game, that was developed initially for folks, for kids, designed for kids in Africa as a way to bring kids together. It's sort of they call them serious games. It's sort of an online social media platform where kids could get together and solve problems together and post results, whether it's go look at issues of water quality in your area, and why don't you document them and share ways that you would try to solve some of the issues and problems that you have. And we just threw it out there to see what would happen. And kids out of this created over 100,000 blog posts with their own content that they would then share and that were used in schools. So it's an interesting experiment in seeing in places where there wasn't content available in topics that were current, if we could actually work with teachers and students to have them create some things that might be relevant themselves and to analyze and see just where and how they might be relevant. So this issue of active in different approaches to using gaming, animation, simulation, these types of things are things that we see not only in developed markets like in the States, but also in some of the less developed countries around the world. We're also seeing interesting and innovative approaches to working with the private sector. In the ICT area, there's a belief, whether it's correct or not, I guess we can argue about, but there's certainly a belief that, government and the public sector, it just doesn't understand this stuff like the private sector does. The private sector is where the brains are, it's where the money is, and so if we want to use technology in education, we need to figure out how to bring the private sector into our schools. Whether this is a good thing or not, we can debate, in ways that they haven't been perhaps active before. And we see lots of governments, especially in middle-income countries and in lower-income countries, trying to figure out ways where they want to invest in technology, ways to bring in new players, oftentimes technology companies, into the public education system in ways that are new. And they think that there's a value in doing it. And we can hopefully talk a little bit about that later and what some of the challenges and what some of the results of that be. So theme number 2, community. I don't know if you're familiar with this quote, which is from a guy named Mark Prensky, who's a US-based sort of a pundit or thinker, writer, speaker about technology use in education. ICTs are transforming education everywhere but in the classroom. This is certainly something that we see in country after country. People would argue that this is the case in many OECD countries and places in, like the United States as well, where we see technology use by kids, by students, by teachers outside the school, not really being that relevant to technology use inside elementary and secondary schools as well. Saying there's a real lost opportunity where kids have access to technology and have oftentimes sophisticated uses of technology in their personal lives. These don't have sort of analogs in the way that they are using together with their teachers technology in the school system. This is something that we see repeated as well in the education systems in developing countries quite as much. Even where in the technology used in most places we're active is the phone. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, the phone is the one ICT tool that is, for the most part, not allowed in schools in middle and low-income countries at all. There's been a belief in computer labs where we get back to this idea of innovation. Well, if we want schools to be innovative, let's bring in technology. And where do we bring that technology in? Where do we place it? Let's put it in a computer lab, a special dedicated place. This is where innovation is going to occur in the school, and it will diffuse out, perhaps into different classrooms among different teachers. That hasn't worked out too well in most places. And increasingly we see this idea, and it's being fueled also by the ready availability of low-cost mobile devices, that, you know, if you bring all your technology and put it in one place, actually that's a good way to make sure that you're not going to change what you're doing, that you're not going to be innovative. And we've seen a big move away from, whereas 10 years ago people were buying lots of computers and sticking them in labs, or people were donating computers in the global West and donating them to the South to be put into computer labs. We've seen this sort of activity not quite grind to a halt, but almost. The paradigm for technology use in education that we saw as standard only 10 years ago is, for the most part, not in consideration in most places where we work today. I don't know how we plan where we make such radical shifts only in the course of 10 years. You know, and this is something we've seen where we look at a place like Uruguay, who I'll talk about more in a second. Uruguay is the first country in the world where every kid has her own free laptop. Second, actually, Niue, the Pacific Island nation of Niue, is actually the first, but that's only, I've met the Minister of Education from Niue. Our business card says Minister of Education, and then the next line is Principal Niue Secondary School. There are only 2 schools in the country. So let's say that Uruguay is the first country as well. If we look, they've said that we're going to dispense entirely with this idea of innovation occurring only in one place in education, in a school. We're going to say let's diffuse it everywhere. Let's diffuse it not only inside school, but because kids have laptops that they take home, let's diffuse it more broadly across society wherever learning may be taking place. In Thailand, they've said we've invested all this money in computer labs for the last 10 years, and we do think the computer lab idea is a bit of a barrier to changing things. So let's change this computer teacher, who really was sort of the queen or king of the particular room in the school, and let's change them to someone who will just support teachers. And let's have the normal subject teachers, the standard subject teachers, go in and use the classroom on a rotating basis, and the computer teacher's just there to support. So again, sort of a radical rethinking of how, and the modality of computer use in schools in a middle-income country like Thailand. When we see that, let's put computers on wheels, let's move them around schools. And we also see that now that there's this installed infrastructure, let's think about how we can use technology to reach outside the school as well, whether it's communication with parents, as we see in a number of schools in Brazil, whether we see in Kenya, in Tanzania, where you can get exam results delivered to you or your family by SMS now, and the use of technology as well in schools, or where schools are a place where technology is used by the community as a way to share information about government expenditure and expenditure in the education sector as well. we're also seeing a different approach to content, or to teacher professional development related to content. This idea of open educational resources is a compelling one. We don't have money for a new textbook, or we don't have the ability to have updated content. So let's have our teachers develop the content, and let's have that content somehow vetted, judged, analyzed, and then diffused throughout our education system. We found in experiments we've been involved with in Nicaragua, in Uganda, and a number of places around the world, where there's real value in that sort of activity, but it's not in the value of the content that's created. We've seen that there's a real value in content creation on the part of teachers because it can be an important part of their professional development as teachers. Apologies about that. Glad I didn't tell everybody to ask, please shut your mobile phone off before I started. Because once you develop content yourself, oftentimes you have a different perspective on your use of that content. And you engage with that content in different ways once you've thought of how you would develop that yourself. So we see content development activities, which a couple years ago were focused on creating open educational resources. That's still something that's considered. We see them increasingly used as part of, or an interest in, promoting teacher professional development, which we also think is an interesting change as well. And related to that, we see opportunity where there's technology in schools, and oftentimes we see that there's insufficient resources dedicated to the maintenance of this technology. And of course, if it doesn't work, you can't use it. We've seen interesting experiments and widespread, I guess, programs, whether it's in Macedonia, whether it's in Indonesia, to use students to maintain all the technology in schools. This can be powerful in a number of ways. Oftentimes these are done, or in those two specific circumstances, they were done initially because they said this will give students relative or relevant skills in the job market. That may or may not be the case, but what it did do pretty clearly, some of the research has shown that it did change the way some of these kids thought about themselves and their education, given the responsibility for what were perhaps the most expensive things in that school. The purchase of a computer may be the cost of a teacher's salary for 4 months. It changed some of the ways that participating students bought into their educational experience, and it was an important or useful mechanism to bring in some students who were sort of marginalized in certain ways and to bring them back into sort of some of the mainstream of activities in education. So an interesting way that technology use in the education in schools was used for a purpose, or it turned out to be useful for a purpose for which it wasn't initially considered. So, things that are personal. As I mentioned, Uruguay, the first country in the world where every student has their own laptop computer. There's this belief in one-to-one computing. A lot of there's a power in one-to-one computing. In the state of Maine in the US, where a lot of sort of the initial experiments took place. I don't know if anyone here went to school in Maine when this started out, where they gave free laptops to middle school students. And they said, we think something useful and important will happen. We think interesting changes will happen if we do that. We're not quite sure what they'll be. And lots of people, and certainly vendors, have looked at this experience, and they've used it as a way to say to education systems around the world, you should be buying one computing device for all your kids, because it's really important that each student have her own device. And I think one of the things the Uruguayans said, we think every student having her own device is useful, but we think it's useful for a number of reasons. We think it's useful because, or it's only useful if everyone has their own device, and they can use it whenever they want to use it, and they can use it at the point of learning. It's this idea of segmenting or segregating technology use away from everything else we do in education. That meant it was marginal or not as useful. And this is a lesson, I think, that some countries, and the Uruguayans are great examples of, that they've said, when you're buying technology and huge amounts of technology, if we're not suffusing it throughout the education system and thinking about it holistically, we're probably not taking good advantage of that investment. Also in Uruguay, again, I'll come back to that example, they've said, you know, we'll give every kid her own computer, her own laptop, because we think that's a great way to diffuse technology throughout society. Because if you want to get a computing into every home, if you give it to every kid, it will automatically be in every home. And then grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles will have some sort of exposure as well. And this is another way to use the education sector, one way to use the education sector as a sort of a vector for change that can maybe impact other things as well. So there's this idea, I think, and the Uruguayans believe that when you buy technology, having a one-to-one ratio of device to person can bring about something fundamentally different. Now, people may say that actually this is an artificial, I guess, construct, that actually if you look at, I don't know how many devices you all have on your person right now. I have at least 4. I have 5 within one step away from me. And so this idea of a multiplicity of devices for each user is something that we're thinking about, or is a reality in sort of developed OECD countries. But in lower middle income and lower income countries, we're seeing this desire to reach at least this ratio of 1-to-1 that is driving, for better or for worse, many investment decisions in the education sector. And we also see an interest, as I said, in Uruguay, where they bought a lot of technology and put it in the hands of students so they could get it into households. They thought interesting things would happen that they couldn't plan for. In Uruguay, and a number of other countries have followed their lead, they said, we don't think test scores will improve. We have no basis to think they will improve, looking at research around the world. But we think some other things will occur if we do this. And we're not really sure what they will be. But we're a small country, sandwiched between 2 big ones. Uruguay's sort of in the middle of South America between Argentina and Brazil, the 2 huge economic giants of South America. And they said, we have our people. We have a small number of people here, and we need to invest in them in some way. And they've said, we think that if we invest in technological literacy, we think that will be one component of a larger set of, an important component of larger sets of investments we're going to make in our young people that we think will pay big dividends. But they weren't really sure what they would be. And this is interesting. A lot of times countries are challenged to use technology because they feel that they're going to be left behind. Because their neighbor maybe isn't making investments, and they say, if we don't do this, we're going to fall behind. They're not exactly sure how or why they're going to fall behind, but they think, at least as far as pictures go, they will be behind. Uruguay felt that, sure, but they also said, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but let's be serious about monitoring and evaluating whatever changes do occur. Now, it was before they embarked on this experiment, they did a test of technology literacy among 17-year-olds. And they happened to do the same test 2 years later after the laptops were rolled out, and they found that the median score of 7-year-olds was about the same as the median score of 17-year-olds had been 2 years before. And they said, we don't know what the impact of that's going to be, but it's 10 years. We think it's going to be interesting to find out. Now, taking these sorts of risks, perhaps some may argue they are risky. In Uruguay, the Minister of Education at one point famously said, we've jumped off a big cliff here and we're not sure how we're going to land. But once we've jumped off this cliff, we need to figure out how to land safely. And to land safely, we need to make sure that we monitor and evaluate what we're doing and make mid-course corrections. And this is a reality, I think, of a lot of technology investments made by the public sector. Is whatever reason you do it for at the start, whatever happens, it's not going to be successful if you don't think about how you're going to change what you're doing based on what you've learned as you undergo that journey. Things in mobile. So the phone, I guess I've already put this picture up once before, and this is sort of the new device that everyone is interested in, certainly in the ICT4D space. We ask ourselves, is this the new photo opportunity? Like this, we've got pretty kids in Pakistan, or this would be in India, I guess, using mobile devices. Are these photo opportunities, or do these offer promising new opportunities for literacy and for reading? We were talking earlier today in a small group here, and I made the comment that in many cases the mobile phone in the ICT4D space, the mobile phone is sort of the telecenter in your pocket. Those of you who've been in this area for a while are thinking about the rhetoric 10 years ago about the idea of setting up sort of village information kiosks where you have sort of internet cafes. Investments in there would bring computing and the power of the internet to the masses. A lot of the rhetoric around that we now see repeated talking about investments in mobile phones. And it's interesting to see how some of the same rhetoric is repeated even where it didn't perhaps bear out with earlier investments. We think that the new technology will bear it out. So phones. I know that there's some work here looking at the use of phones for reading and phones for literacy. Is there a relevance? What relevance might there be? So sort of a question we ask ourselves, because we're asked by countries to think about different approaches using technology to help them with basic challenges with literacy. And we ask ourselves, what's happening out there? How might this be relevant, given that these phones are increasingly available everywhere? So in asking ourselves that question, I thought I would start with sort of perhaps inappropriately some data about toilets. From the New York Times 2 years ago, that's when the first time that the number of mobile phone subscriptions in the world exceeded the number of people who had access to clean toilets, to show just how pervasive this small computer in people's pocket or pocketbook was becoming, that it's something that's even more available, for better or for worse, than clean toilets. Can we take advantage of that increasing ubiquity in ways that are useful? Well, the folks at the Sesame Workshop, sort of people who've made done some of the seminal work related to the use of educational technologies, of course, based initially on the power and potential of television, have said that they really see that just as Sesame Street helped transform TV, they think that the new advances are primarily going to happen in the mobile space, and where they used, and it's a widely, so they're seen as a real thought leader and a leading practitioner in the use of one educational technology, television, to promote literacy. They see that in the future they're going to be relevant in the mobile space. Now, whether this occurs or not, we'll see, but it's interesting that at least one of the big leaders in this area is making this big pivot. The corporate sector is jumping into this area in a big way. We see, whether it's Nokia or Pearson, other places, the BBC, you can argue whether they're corporate or not, are making big investments in the use of mobile technologies to support basic literacy activities that they're involved in, whether it's in Bangladesh with the BBC Janala program, whether it's in India, whether it's China, whether it's in Indonesia. We're seeing a lot of corporate interest in the use of mobile technologies to promote basic literacy ideas. So I think there must be some demand and some potential utility here. Because these things are increasingly pervasive, powerful, they're increasingly cheap or inexpensive, and they're personal. Jan Chipchase, when he was one of the lead user design guys at Nokia a couple years ago, made the observation that, increasingly the phone is the last thing you touch. Maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse or something, or your child before you go to sleep. Then the phone is the last thing you touch, and that's the first thing you reach for. So there's almost no object that's more personal and closer to you during the day than your phone. And is there some way we can take advantage of that increasingly personal device that's relevant to our learning? Because it's not with you just at home, it's with you wherever you are, wherever you go, because it's mobile. It's something you can use anytime, anywhere. And people ask ourselves, and we talked about this afternoon, can you read on these things? Can you really read them? Well, even just 6 years ago now, 5 of the top 10 best-selling novels in Japan were cell phone novels. They were written on phones and published to phones via text messaging by and for young adults. So there's a tradition in some places. In Japan, you might say a technology outlier in so many ways. What's relevant in Japan in use of technology, whether it's fetishized or whether a special place, that's not relevant in different parts of the world. Well, in South Africa, they had a very similar experience. In the use of, they had a project it's now called the Yoza Project, sponsored by the Shuttleworth Foundation and implemented by a number of local groups there, where they provided, I guess you'd call it TeenLit, via a special messaging system that they have in South Africa. They provided sort of TeenLit to teenagers. In many houses, they found that there was one book, was the median number of books, and it was the Bible. Certainly a potential tool for literacy, but oftentimes not leisure reading for many teenagers. And so they said, maybe if we can make available via phones, which most kids have access to. They did one study, and even in a lower income township in Soweto, they found that 92% of kids had ready and regular access to a mobile phone, whether if they didn't have it themselves, a friend had it or something. So that this is something that if they could distribute content over this device, would kids read it? And they found out they did quite a bit. So poor townships in South Africa, rich areas of Japan, it looks like kids can or are willing to read. Isn't it too small? Well, perhaps it's too small. I don't know how many of you read on phones, but if you don't have access to books and you don't have access to other things or things that are up to date, if this is your option, if it's your own opportunity, maybe it isn't too small because it's big enough. It's big enough for you. Some people have even and in Texas a couple years ago they did some research on this question where they asked specifically about screen size. They asked kids about screen size, and the response puzzled the researchers, most of whom were in their 40s and 50s. The kids basically said, the screen size that's the size. It's not too big or too small, it just is. Now, equating sort of responses of kids in Texas to how kids in other parts of the world, it may not be, you can make that responsibly, that comparison, or maybe you can, but this is just to highlight that maybe some of these questions aren't as relevant as we thought they were. We had people here who've actually worked on this project in the room in India, where the idea was to use educational games on mobile phones as a way to promote or explore the potential of the mobile device and the game modality to promote literacy. An interesting approach, I think, to using or to utilizing an activity that many people use mobile phones for, gaming. Gaming when they're not doing something else, gaming in between things that they're doing as a way to introduce perhaps things that are educationally relevant. Some people have noted, and whether this research is valid, perhaps I have some questions about, but people have noted, you know, when you read a book and the way people decode words and things on the screen, in some cases it might actually be useful to have a very small amount of text that you're trying to decode and make sense of. Whether it's because you have some sort of learning disability, but maybe the focused attention is actually useful to certain types of learners. I don't know if that's the case, but certainly it's a potentially promising area of research and inquiry. Can you write with them? People say, you know, is this a lean forward or a lean back device? Well, we do see people, I don't know how many texts the average person here in the room sends. I don't know if you still text or if that's old-fashioned on your phone, but lots of people are using phones to send text messages a lot. And we do see examples not only in Japan of people using mobile phones actually as a way to author text as well. So not only a device that people read with, but actually a way that people provide content for other people to read with. Here's one example out of the University of Maryland that they've been using in China and Mongolia to use mobile phones actually as a mechanism to create things for mobile phones that would be read on mobile phones. Aren't they distracting, people would say, in the educational environment in school? Well, yeah, certainly. We have 55 countries in the world we have on a list where they banned the use of mobile phones in school. So it's interesting that the technology that's most used by learners in most of the world is the technology expressly forbidden in many schools. Whether that continues over time, I don't know, but presumably there will be pressures put on some of these decisions. We had one education minister talk to us, I guess he was visiting us back in June. He said, you know, we banned phones initially, and now we found out that, and the Justice Ministry banned them because we're having social problems because of phones. And now we in the education sector see that there's actually a relevance, and we're trying to figure out how to advocate for this ban, this is an African country, this ban to be overturned. What data do you have that we can share with them? Because this decision that was made based on one reason we think is actually contrary to some of the interests of the education system in this country in East Africa. Interesting, at least interesting to me. And of course there's lots of stuff we don't know, whether it's related to safety, whether it's related to costs, whether it's related to access to electricity, although most people can figure out a way to charge their phone, and there's access to, people can keep their phones running in ways that schools often can't keep computers running because of lack of reliable access to electricity. There's a lot we don't know about the cognitive neuroscience about all this, how different user groups, whether it's poor students, whether it's students from ethnic minorities, whether it's boys versus girls, how it impacts all this sort of stuff. It's really a new and I think exciting and emerging area of research, and it's something that if you are interested in ICT4D, especially as related to education, this might be a promising area for you to investigate, and I know some of you in the room are doing just that. We also see technology, and especially phones, used to support teachers in innovative ways. This Bridge IT project that started in the Philippines has since moved to Tanzania, has moved to Chile as a way to take this device that teachers already know how to use. You don't need to teach them how to use a phone, typically like you need to teach them how to use a computer, and say, how can we use this to support what teachers are doing in their teaching? Let's not teach them a new device, let's just give them a new functionality to the device they already know how to use. We're still in the early days of this exploration, I guess, of ICT, or of mobile phones and literacy, mobile phones and reading, but I think this is one promising area I wanted to highlight to all of you who are looking for potential areas of research, or even areas or places or ways to make a career. And indeed, mobile phone may be the wrong term to use. We're talking about something that's small and portable, you know, phones. I don't know how many of you get calls. I was actually shocked that I got a telephone call there. I basically don't use my phone for calling hardly ever. I don't even know why I have a voice plan. And in most of the world, phones are used for texting and for data, and they're not used for phoning in the traditional sense as well. And so asking that, you know, phones where they weren't available, where 20 years ago they were afforded only by the stereotypical image was perhaps a Western-looking executive on the golf course with his mobile phone that was about this big. And now we think about phones diffused throughout societies, cultures, used even or perhaps especially by some of the poorest groups as in ways that are integral to their daily lives. We think about that change that's happened, and we ask countries that are developing or paying for lots of content to be developed, we ask them, how are you thinking about how this content is going to be used in the future? Do you want to think about developing content in ways, whether it's adherence to standards or in ways that are flexible so that they can be accessed and used on whatever device comes, or at least anticipate that whatever device, whatever form factor is being used by learners to read electronic digital content is probably going to change. So how do you want to plan for the development of that content in the first place? We know that, I mean, the price of data storage has fallen by huge amounts in the last 30 years. This is a quote from a senior vice president of Google who says that, you know, based on the trends observed over the last 20 years, all the world's content, digital content, would sit inside an iPod, what an iPod will be. And music would sit in your palm as early as 2015. Now, whether it actually ends up sitting in your palm or whether it's all in the cloud, I don't know. But says that, you know, a lot of places around the world have been in a rush to connect all their schools because we need to connect schools, I think for lots of valid reasons. But they say of access, because we need them to have access to information. And I think that's a valid, and at the World Bank we certainly think that's a valid rationale. But we also say, you know, you can increasingly store huge amounts of data and only use the internet connectivity for other types of things where you actually need real-time or near real-time interactions. And if you're investing in thinking about investments in technology for education system holistically, you're thinking about we want access to allow kids to have access to reading materials, for example, you may actually increasingly be able to put on, whether it's a memory stick, which today holds the content that maybe would only be reasonably held on a big server at the Ministry of Education. So it changes the dynamics, I think, of what you think about what costs may be and how you want to use the scarce resources, because connectivity is still scarce in much of the world, in ways that are perhaps most effective. So last, measuring all this stuff. How do you know what's effective when you talk about using technology in education systems around the world, whether high-income, middle, or low-income countries? How do you know, especially what's cost-effective? You know, how do you know how or to what extent they make schools more productive and efficient than they currently are? How can they help transform teaching and learning into an engaging and active process connected to real life? How do they help, or do they help at all prepare the current generation of young people for the future workforce? If you were to really condense the three general questions that we get at the World Bank from the countries with which we work, I think they would fall basically into these three general categories of questions. So how well are we doing as we try to answer these sorts of questions, which seem to be relevant to lots of places around the world. Emily, how do we know answers to these questions? Unfortunately, we still don't have a good idea. Hopefully this is the kind of things that we can look to Penn and other places and all of you to help us find out answers to questions. We're making investments in lots of stuff for which we actually don't have good proof of the efficacy of these investments or the cost effectiveness of these investments. We don't actually know what the impacts are, yet we're still investing in them to a great extent. And we're also making investments thinking about what's possible right now or what happened before. Where we think about our evidence base, this also is a challenge for us, where we think about what yesterday's evidence tells us about the relevance of investment in technologies and education. You know, yesterday's lesson may not be as relevant to what happens in the future. You know, to what extent are we looking and how relevant are the evidence base from the past as we look forward? Or are we really talking about looking backwards when we're making plans for the future, which is perhaps a dodgy course of action? We ask ourselves at the bank, and I think in the international community who's interested in these issues, you know, are we satisfied with the way we measure impact and the tools we use to do these types of measurements? And I don't think we are. And so we ask ourselves, if all this technology is increasingly available in education systems around the world, is there scope for being innovative actually in how we measure impact? And perhaps one of the ways we help meet this challenge is to think of interesting, innovative ways to use the technologies, the very things that we're trying to evaluate. We are a big proponent of randomized controlled trials, the gold standard, I guess, of evaluation sort of in the social sciences. Expensive things, but we see very, very few randomized controlled trials of the impact of technology. I can count them on, now at this point I can probably count them on 2 hands around the world. And I think about the gold standard of impact assessment. It's not certainly the only one. We can argue about its relevance in certain circumstances. But the fact there have been only a couple handfuls of randomized controlled trials about the use of technology in education in developing countries around the world, where we see, and I know at the World Bank, just in the last couple months, I've seen proposals for over $500 million of investment in multi-billions in an additional country across my desk. And yet we don't have a solid evidence base on which can help inform our choices in this area. You know, we do see the use of technologies to help us, these very ICTs we're trying to assess the impact of. We do see the use of these things in interesting ways as well as we try to assess other things. Experiments in India to use, for example, digital cameras to help monitor teacher attendance, where you take pictures. This famous experiment that folks in MIT did where they took pictures of teachers. And the mere fact of taking pictures, some have drawn conclusions to say that the mere fact of taking pictures and having them sent every day, or the promise of having them sent, increased teacher participation in schools in India. They showed up more. So there are interesting ways that you can use the technologies that are already in schools and in communities, perhaps, to do other types of evaluation or monitoring activities that weren't possible before. But again, I think there's an interest also, and we see, particularly in countries that are making large investments in technology in their education systems, to think about the impact beyond just the education sector. You know, one of the things that they found out in Uruguay was that once every kid had their own laptop computer, I don't know if you know what the products are that they make in Uruguay. So it's a big timber country. They make a lot of money from timber now, but it's primarily cattle. So lots of kids, especially in the outside the city, but even the kids in the city who have relatives who live outside the city, it's a cattle country. And they found that, you know, there are ways that we can teach kids to help monitor the use, the care for cattle, because they have this computing device with them. And we think they're important devices in making technology available in the education sector that have ramifications or that have things we can measure that are of benefit to wider society. And they think that's one of the reasons as well to justify some of these types of investments. Whether that's appropriate in other places or not, whether that's relevant or useful or even true, I'm not sure. I haven't seen the data, but it does highlight a challenge that educational policymakers have when they say, at what level do we measure the impact? If there's an unclear impact in schools, but a larger impact in society, is that okay? Should we be making investments based on that as well? I don't know. That's why I guess that's why you make policy, why you're in government, to wrestle with these sorts of challenges or questions. There are emerging ways to think about as well. This is an industry-led project here to think about these sets of so-called 21st century skills and how we can measure them. A lot of people, there's certainly a lot of rhetoric saying, you know, it's a new century we need. It's been a new century for over a decade. There are new types of skills and competencies we need to develop. And a lot of these are enabled through the use of technology. Not just the use of technology itself, but they can help us to do other things. How do we measure them? I think there's some interesting work going on here. And some of these large-scale international assessments that have measured certain types of competencies in the past are starting to recognize and consider how these different types of competencies perhaps can and should be measured across countries as well, because they're getting, well, they think there's a value in it. They're getting pressure from governments, from families, from companies to say there are other types of things we need to measure as well related to technology use. You know, and all this gets at this issue of measurement, gets at a colleague at the U.S. Department of Education used to joke that, you know, investments in technology and education, that's the real faith-based initiative we have here in the U.S. Because a lot of the decisions we're making, and this is true in other countries around the world as well, are not based on a hard evidence that we have, really based on faith, whether it's faith in progress, whether it's faith in technology. And over time, we would certainly argue, the World Bank, this is perhaps not the best course of action. We're turning now to this issue of innovation. Asking ourselves if innovation results of a bright idea, perhaps, traditionally the way we think of innovation, a person having an insight from somewhere, or is it a result of a commitment to rigorous testing and trial and error? Now, we do certainly think that there is value, and we think the real value, the real potential for innovation, certainly with technology use in education, perhaps won't be realized unless we make a commitment to test, trial, to change course in what we're doing over time. And that's where we hope, and certainly the people with whom, the countries with whom we work, think that there might be opportunities to really change things going forward. Now, I've said that stuff. I don't know how much of this was, well, I don't know how much is interesting. I don't know how much was new to you either, but I just thought I'd end with some things that may not be on your radar screen yet, at least in the context that you're used to hearing about them. And so I'll skip some of the trends perhaps you've already heard about around the world, whether it's, you know, well, I guess you'll see in a couple minutes when I'm talking about, when people talk about trends in educational technology use around the country, around the world, they typically think about what's happening in the States and in Europe. Now, what's happening in the States and in Europe may or may not be relevant, may or may not be trends in other parts of the world, or they may be trends in different ways or for different reasons. So just 10. This whole idea of tablets, as I said before, as I believe I said before, almost every proposal that comes across my desk these days has questions about what tablets we should buy. They're buying millions of these things in Thailand. They're buying tens of millions of these things for schools in Russia. If you're looking at where educational computing is going to take place with tablets, increasingly you should be looking at middle-income countries around the world and not looking at the more developed markets of the West. You know, we see, I imagine most of you probably are on Facebook and probably use it in some way related to your learning, in addition to using it for things that are social. We see around the world that tools like Facebook outside the classroom are oftentimes taking on different functionalities to support learners in ways that education systems haven't anticipated at all. A couple of years ago, I was in an East African country, and they said, because I like to talk to the tech guys in addition to talking to the government you know, decision makers, and they said, you know, can you come look at our server logs with us? Half of the traffic on our national education network is Facebook related. What should we do? Is this a good thing? Or is it a bad thing? This is a country where the internet was brutally slow and was brutally expensive. And they said, it seems to fill a need for students here in our country that was totally shocking and surprising for us. At the same time, the government was thinking about how to make technology relevant to their students. It actually was relevant, and they just weren't aware of it at all. We see interest in, with the democratization of tools to translate materials. Now, if you look at things that have happened, for example, in some of the user communities with Japanese anime, where kids, oftentimes kids, young adults, translate Japanese cartoons into other languages using tools that have developed for that purpose. We see those tools bleeding out and being relevant to other places, being relevant to education systems as they think about ways to democratize or crowdsource large-scale translation of education materials, like the folks at TED, where they have helped support the use of translation tools so other people can take advantage and to subtitle TED Talks in ways that are easy, intuitive for users to do who don't have knowledge of technology. We see that this is something that's happening increasingly, and these tools are becoming increasingly diffused in lower income countries. Whether it's a good thing or not, we could argue about whether it's a good thing to merely translate content from other places. We don't see a lot of content developed in Africa, in lower income places in Asia, and then used in the developed West or even in other developing countries. But it's a strong trend that we see happening sort of under the radar screen in many places. Next one, number 4, the great firewall of everywhere. There's one of the first things that happens in education systems when they realize that things can go out of control with technology use, they say, let's lock everything down. Let's put up big firewalls. A number of countries we all can think of off the top of our head do this quite a bit. And they say, let's just protect kids. But one thing we've seen in the last 5 years is an acknowledgement that it's not just about protecting kids. We can't protect them all the time. So we need, and perhaps in our education system, where we have, whether we're acting in local parentis or we have technology in schools, we need to help educate kids in the ways to keep themselves safe, because we don't think we can just keep themselves. We can keep them safe by blocking everything. This is a big change we've seen in the last 5 years, even in low-income countries. Number 5. Now, most investments in technology and education in middle and low-income countries traditionally gone first to secondary schools. We've seen an increased interest in actually working at the early childhood development or early primary levels. Now, whether this is because there have been lots of investments that have already been made in primary and secondary education and working themselves down through the system, whether it's because the private sector has said we see opportunities to sell to different markets, I'm not sure, but it is notable that companies are targeting parents of young learners in ways, and with products and services that are increasingly cheap, in ways that didn't exist even 5 years ago. We think this is an interesting trend, not only in the App Store in the US, but in middle and low-income countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia as well. Number 6, 5 years ago, we could get very few countries even to think about the use of technology in dealing with special needs students. Now, this is not surprising, perhaps, where education systems were under lots of stresses, and they said, we don't have money for everybody, let alone certain specific groups. But as more technologies become available, and where there is demonstrated positive impact of technology use for certain user groups, it's clear that for many students with various special educational needs, there are clear benefits to technology use. And this is something we see now that's open for discussion in ways that it wasn't at all 5 years ago. All this tech is going to my waste. Again, 5 years ago, we saw, certainly 10 years ago, very few regulations about the disposal of equipment in outside OECD countries. And what did we see as a result? We saw lots of places taking used equipment, donating it to Africa, for example, where they didn't have laws about the disposal of equipment. A lot of this stuff was meant to be destined for the education sector, and some of it was just junk. And there weren't laws to regulate this sort of disposal, and there increasingly are now. And this is changing the dynamics both of computer donation activities and also of the way that technology investments are thought of in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, ways that didn't happen a couple of years ago. Almost to the end, open data, big brother data. So we're also seeing interest in, as you digitize lots of educational processes, whether it's you're clicking through a book, whereas in the past you just leafed through pages, whether the teacher is using an interactive whiteboard, whereas in the past you just wrote on the blackboard. The use of technology, you can store all that information. Is there a value in that information? Increasingly, education systems, vendors think, yes, there is. And they're thinking about ways to collect data related to the actions of teachers and learners because they think it can be mined successfully to get insights about learning. There's a great deal of potential here. There's also a great deal of potential concern given the privacy implications of working with minors and kids and tracking what they do in school and relating that to other things that happen. So we think this is an emerging trend that's worth watching. Number 9, we also see an increased recognition of the fact that if you're going to invest in technology in low-income communities around the world, if you don't invest in the capacity of the teachers, you're in trouble. You're also in trouble if you don't invest in the capacity of principals. Because oftentimes, especially in low-income communities, principal has a disproportionate hold or can allow or permit certain types of activities to occur. And we've seen in country after country where they've invested tens of millions of dollars without a lot of impact, where they invested a couple $100,000 in outreach to principals, then interesting things happened. So number 10, I'll leave number 10 blank. Maybe we can talk about some stuff. I know a number of you have worked and done interesting things around the world, so I thought I would leave that open. Perhaps we can discuss it. I've got some other stuff that I can talk about. I'm happy to share, but I think I'd be happy to end things here now and open things up more for discussion. All right, thanks.
So we have about 15, 20 minutes. Floor is open. If you have a question, comment, please raise your hand and you can maybe call on them and they can also say who they are.
Can I start?
Yeah,
I have a
sure.
question about slide number 127.
Yeah. Okay. The answer is yes, most of the time. Yeah.
No, as we discussed earlier, perhaps one of the things that could be added to that slot is sort of the future impact of what massive open online courses movement is holding for the.
Yeah, I think that's a great. There's a bunch of other stuff that I didn't mention here that we see that people talk about a lot. One is the maker movement. This idea that you can use technology to help create other technologies, and that's an integral part of the way creation of tools can be an important part of the learning experience. And this issue of MOOCs and of open, massively online open courses, I think is something that we're wrestling with at the World Bank. We've been involved in distance learning activities for decades. And some of these have migrated in various ways onto the internet. And some of these sort of what's happening now, people say that, well, what you've been doing is a MOOC of some sort. We do note that most of the things, and I know Penn is involved in this area quite a bit, and most of the institutions that are really innovators in this area and are supporting work are from the US. In fact, almost all of them in a substantial way. And then we wonder what the relevance is of these types of things to places like the higher education needs of learners in Africa, because we're not sure. If we're talking about, oftentimes when people talk about MOOCs, they say it's a way to reduce costs, or at least some of the rhetoric we hear. If we just open up this lecture and instead of delivering it to 20 people, we deliver it to 20,000, man, everything will become a lot cheaper. Yeah, maybe. Where, of course, there's this quality issue and the impact issue. One of the things that we will be announcing next week is a sort of a pilot with one of the big providers to look at if MOOCs are made available to university students in this one African country, what sorts of additional support would we need to put in place? What sort of investments would we need to make sure that this is a relevant and useful educational activity for them? Because, and we see in country after country, university students are accessing, whether it's Coursera lectures or other types of open content, we see that kids are using them, or that students are using them. And the challenge is, how do we make these courses relevant to the educational investments, the university activities that kids are already engaged in? And we think there's a whole set of things, whether it's support, whether it's other types of tutoring and learning communities, perhaps those investments need to be made, as well as ways to assign credit for those offerings. We're going to be exploring those, I guess, over the next year. But we're confused like everyone else is. I think we're excited about the opportunities offered by MOOCs, and our client countries are. People see lots of opportunity, and of course, universities themselves see lots of threats.
Can I follow that up?
Yeah.
Is there, you were saying that much of it is dominated by the U.S. and I'm sure soon by other wealthier countries. Is there any effort among universities in the South to create MOOCs that would compete for the marketplace, like say South Africa for Africa?
Yeah, so there are initiatives, and the World Bank was involved in supporting an initiative starting about 15 years ago called the Africa Virtual University, which was meant, well, it's tried to do a number of things. In its current incarnation, it's meant to be a way for African universities to aggregate their content and their lectures and make them available to other universities. That's an initiative still sort of, I would say, even though it's been around for 15 years, that there's still a lot of experimentation going on. UNISA, the University of South Africa, which is a distance learning institution, is actively thinking about how it can take advantage of, interest in, and the new possibilities offered by these tools. But primarily, unfortunately, and perhaps reasons that we could probably guess at, a number of the higher education institutions we speak with regularly in Africa see these offerings as threats to what they offer already, especially because many of their students are doing them as ways to supplement, maybe not even complement, supplement, perhaps replace, or perhaps learn some of the things that they're not learning at university there. So we're not seeing a lot of activity, one, because investments are big to establish a big presence online and to have the available connectivity. It's not thought that these markets are ripe for that sort of investment, yet we're seeing students access things like Coursera a lot.
Hi, I guess I missed this part when you were talking on this slide in particular. I'm very curious on, what does the World Bank do, or how does it work with the maker movement? Personally, I'm very curious because I wonder if you've heard of the Fab Lab project at MIT. I worked with a Fab Lab for quite a while, so I'm quite involved.
So, in those 9 trends that I listed that we see, they're sort of under the radar screen. These trends that I listed up here, so the maker movement, bring your own device or bring your own technology movement, augmented reality, we see that there's a lot of, let's say, the PowerPoint presentation to activity ratio is very high. We see lots of presentations about the potential use of these sorts of things. We see lots of rhetoric about certain pilot projects using these sorts of things, but we don't see them gaining much traction yet in places where we work. We're not saying that's a good thing. We're not saying it's a bad thing. We're just not noticing it. We pay a lot of attention to the Fab Lab stuff a number of us are big fans of. It seems like that a number of education systems have trouble figuring out how to take advantage of the changes that are taking place, whether it's with 3D printing or the availability of low-cost things like Arduinos and those types of things. They're not sure how to make that fit inside their education system, especially when they have all sorts of other challenges, immediate challenges, against which they're measured. So this is something we think is certainly promising. We do see some activity in Uruguay and Costa Rica, and where there's a legacy of educational robotics, oftentimes related to the use of things like Lego Mindstorms. We see some take up, but we just don't see it gaining traction yet. We think there's a lot of promise in it, but our clients aren't asking about it at all. Yeah?
You mentioned that at the moment there hasn't been a lot of research done into the effectiveness and the efficiency of some of these new technologies. But sort of based on what you do know and what research has been done, I'm wondering whether you can give us some examples of situations where mobile technology has been used effectively for literacy, for reading, and then some situations where maybe it hasn't worked.
Yeah, and so anybody in the room can feel free to chime in and answer this question as well. Certainly the second half's a lot easier. Second question, where things don't work. Unfortunately, a lot of what we see is, we see a real differentiator in effectiveness, or where systems are effective, is where they're able to recognize where things don't work and make changes as a result. Because in very few cases, when you have your first swing at the ball, do you hit it? maybe even the third or fourth or eighth time it takes you before you figure out a really effective or a useful way to make use of technology. Or maybe it's just a matter of time. There's a learning curve you need to ride up. Certainly that's possible as well. And the mobile technologies and learning, I mean, I would say, so this outside of school, we don't really see much inside of school. Outside of school, the South Africa example is interesting in the fact that they were able to make available reading materials to promote reading by groups that weren't doing much leisure reading at all. And it turns out that one of the reasons they weren't doing leisure reading is they just didn't have access to things to read, other than certain types of things they weren't interested in reading. So we see things like this YOSA project where it's really outside of school use is where we see some of the most interesting activities taking place. We just don't see that much happening yet in school that is really demonstrating any sort of real impact. It's still early days.
Could I chime in there? And I'm going to turn, Nathan, I'm going to give you a chance to think for a second of what works based on, because you're doing part of a review, but I would say it's a good moment to come in on it because YOSA, which you can Google and look up, Shuttleworth, it's a well-known project, they did find a lot of activity, as Mike is saying. What they didn't assess was what people learned. Lots of activity, we don't know who was active. And it's very likely, we think, that they were active mainly in English in South Africa, which is, English is a minority language, or at least a second language for most people. So evaluation often in this field is relatively new, and people make claims based on one level of evaluation, but may not be addressing the issue that you might have thought you wanted to know. And if you don't mind, maybe we could ask Nathan, who's doing a bit of review of things that work. Do you have something based on where you're at that you'd like to mention?
Well, I think just kind of building off of your comments, the issue that I'm finding, at least in my research, is that where there are claims of impact or evaluations, they're not entirely rigorous or credible from an academic perspective. You see projects that are in their pilot phase. I know World Reader was one that had an evaluation conducted on it. There's other smaller initiatives, Bridge IT, which was mentioned here in a number of different countries, that have shown impact from one perspective. But when you look deeper into the detail of the evaluation, you'll see that they were conducted with very small samples. So in order to, how much you can generalize that to other situations, scenarios, regions is very limited. And so that's an ongoing process that we're going through right now where we see, yes, there's initial success or there's inclinations towards success for a lot of these initiatives, but how much we can rely on those results is another story.
So getting back to that one specific YOSA example, for me, one of the most interesting things, or one of the most interesting things that have happened as a result of that is they found out the kids were writing, let's call it fan fiction. The kids were actually writing as a result and sharing what they wrote, comments on what they read about, she did this, should she have done this with her boyfriend, should us, and writing and sharing that information with groups of peers. And the promotion, perhaps, the use of these access to reading materials to promote writing was something that they hadn't thought about at all. Again, an unintended, potentially an unintended consequence that has educational value. But I guess that is meant to highlight the fact that once you put these things in the hands of users, you often find interesting things out, and they're not the things you're looking for in the first place. Doesn't mean you shouldn't look for things. We should, of course. But if we're not thinking about monitoring and evaluating what's happening with we probably won't learn these types of interesting things or see these types of interesting things happen.
So was there another question? Please.
Yeah. So the trend of educational technology throughout the world is really great for everyone. But one of the major problems I see is recognition of education, specifically higher education from other countries. Like a number of my friends are always telling me about how they themselves or friends they know come here with degrees from other countries, only to find that they have to go through the process of getting another degree And so how do you see, I guess, the World Bank or just the world in general, like solving that problem, maybe through the use of educational technology or something else?
Yeah, so this issue of credit, let's say this issue of credit or recognition across systems certainly is a challenge, and they have a challenge that they've been dealing with in Europe, especially for a long time, and they have processes to deal with it. But I think one thing I would mention that's interesting that's been going on is this issue of badging. So the MacArthur Foundation has supported with Mozilla and other places, have supported really experiments in the creation of certain badges. So online representations of things you have learned or things you have done that can then be recognized or that have a recognized value, and they're thinking whether it's by schools or by employers, but they think there's a space, and they think technology can play a role in both in demonstrating that you have done something and sharing that with groups of people in ways that are recognized outside traditional sort of credentials and credentialing. That's one way around some of these issues. It certainly isn't, it doesn't deal with the issue itself, but it's still at its exploratory stage. But I think this issue of providing recognition for types of skills and maybe even attitudes in some cases and competencies that aren't measured as well in our normal education system, I think that's an area that there's going to be a lot of innovation going forward. And a lot of that sharing of information is going to happen via technology.
Last question, brief one, and we'll close it out. Please.
Thank you. I was wondering whether there is any new initiative that is helping countries like Uganda or Rwanda, high school students to connect with international schools in America or in Europe, so that they can exchange or create this learning environment through technology.
Yeah, so there are groups. So as Rwanda, for one example, becomes more connected, as connectivity improves, and as there is more access to computers in schools, and there have been initiatives for the last 5 years that have been trying to do that. I think this offers an opportunity to involve, whether it's Rwandans, Ugandans, in existing networks of learners and teachers around the world. There's a group called iEarn that was formed out of Columbia Teachers College 25 years ago as a way for kids in the then Soviet Union and the United States to be sort of digital or electronic pen pals by fax. That's now entirely online, and they have, 12,000 teachers work with students around the world who come together around certain learning activities. There's probably a few folks in Rwanda. There certainly are folks in Uganda who participate in iEarn. But really, as connectivity rolls out and people are more connected, I think the incorporation of groups, let's say from Rwanda and Uganda, in global learning communities, it's happening. And there are private companies that do this as well. ePals is a big one based outside of Washington, D.C. One thing we've seen in these, though, as well, is because I was involved in a project that tried to do that for a number of years, that did do that. While there was interest, for example, in connecting kids in Accra, in Ghana, with kids in Chicago, the kids in Accra were really interested in being connected with kids in Cape Coast and Kumasi and other parts of Ghana that they weren't connected with, or even other kids in Accra. And the technology was very interesting to them and relevant because they could connect with folks even in their own city, in their own country, in ways that they couldn't before. And in ways that were perhaps easier than connecting across cultural lines, across linguistic lines, across time zones, those types of things. So that was one interesting thing that we found, where there was, we're involved in these sort of twinning relationships to have kids in Africa talk with kids in the US, and those went so far. The ones that really took hold were where kids in one part of the country connected with each other. And this was a way for them to connect in ways that they couldn't before. So I just mentioned that it was an unanticipated finding from establishing those sorts of connections.
Okay, well, let me just say, as part of thanks, that we were talking a little bit earlier, and I learned that one thing I didn't have a chance to ask, and maybe I'll ask a little later, is Mike, one of the things he does is try to, of course, in this, I call this a pretty provocative talk. There's a lot that I could debate. Certainly, when he gives this among ministers of education and so on, there's a lot of questions. We may be aware of some of those, but other people feel pressure to kind of ask questions and respond. So Mike, in the next few weeks, is going to be leading the most prominent topic at the bank's retreat. It's called the Failure Fair. It's about failures in development. And you can kind of see that come out of here, because a lot of this is challenging the field in all these different vectors, really, of activity. So that's perfect for us, because we like to understand what works and especially what doesn't work, so we can maybe charge some of the ground. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
See you again.